And when a virus or a bacteria or a fungus gets down all the way into our lungs, into those air sacs, it can cause inflammation, and we fill up with fluid or pus down in our lungs, and that keeps us from being able to move the oxygen that we need to move. And lots of different germs can cause that. The classic virus to cause it is influenza. The classic bacteria, I hope many of you have had the shot for, is a strep bacteria called strep pneumonia, because it's one that causes pneumonia a lot. So lots of things can cause pneumonia, including COVID-19, and that's one of the things that we're most worried about. Next slide. And one of the things that's been confusing for doctors and nurses and is confusing for patients is how much of what is happening is the virus and how much of what is happening are other infections that we're getting because of the virus, or how much is just our immune response. And what we think is going on right now is there is a series of activities that happen with COVID. First, you get infected, and you might be asymptomatic, not have any symptoms, and you might stay asymptomatic. Or you might be pre-symptomatic. You don't have any symptoms today, but you might tomorrow or the next day. Now, one of the things that we all need to be aware of is that one of the reasons that COVID has spread so well is that we are able to shed the virus in that pre-symptomatic or maybe even that asymptomatic phase. So I don't know that I'm sick yet, but I get around you. Tomorrow I get sick, but I infected you today. Not knowing that I already had COVID. So that's that early phase. And then as the virus reproduces in our body, we start to get those mild symptoms, that headache, the fatigue. And then for those of us who progress on to the really severe disease, some of that is viral reproduction, a lot of virus building up in us, but a lot of it is that our immune system attacks it so hard that we get over-inflammation. So now what doctors are doing is if we catch people early on in the course of COVID, we treat them with antivirals to try to block the virus. But if we're catching them later on, we're treating them with anti-inflammatories like steroids. Some of you may have been on prednisone or some other steroid for your arthritis or other diseases. So steroids like prednisone, we give in big doses to try to clamp down that overactive immune response and help get the fluid out of the lungs. And there are more and more antivirals and anti-inflammatories being tested. And when we look at overall how much better are we doing now for treating COVID than we were a year ago, it's a lot better because of those medicines, but I want to say it's a lot better because our nurses and our respiratory therapists and all the care providers in the hospital have learned to be less scared of the virus, spend more time with the patients under protection. They've learned how to help them breathe deeper, roll them over, help move that fluid around, and it's really been that loving human touch that has made even more of a difference than these medicines. Next slide. Well, where are we in the epidemic? How are we doing? Well, pretty terribly, actually. So right now, worldwide, we have over 200 million cases, documented cases of COVID-19, and almost 4.5 million deaths. And you can see on that map where they distribute. The United States happens to be among the worst hit places in the world. Now, are those numbers accurate? Most certainly not. When I talk to my friends in Africa, in the Middle East, they are getting sick, they are having trouble, but they don't have all the tests needed to be able to document it, and even if they do have a test, the reports don't go in. So the map of Africa, some of the maps of South America and Asia look like they're not having as big a problem. They're having big problems. This is a worldwide catastrophe. In fact, right now, Indonesia is having more cases and more deaths than anywhere in the world. And we hardly hear about it in the United States. Well, how about in the United States? Next slide. We've had almost 40 million cases, 38.5 million documented so far. When I sent Pastor Mia this slide Friday, it was 634,520 deaths. This morning it's 637,000 plus deaths. So every day we're seeing hundreds, thousands of more deaths spread around the United States. Next slide. And where are we in the curve? Well, we had gone up. We all know how much we suffered around Christmas and New Year's, how many hospitalizations we had then, and then we came down dramatically. And I confess, I thought we were doing really, really well. I was one of the voices saying, hey, I think enough of us have gotten vaccinated, enough of us have gotten infected, that we're gonna do okay. We're gonna cruise to the end of this. And I was wrong. The Delta variant changed that dramatically, and our curve has gone right back up. So for the Wake Forest system, Wake Forest Baptist and High Point and Lexington and Wilkes and Davie County hospitals, for those hospitals and those clinics, every day we put out our numbers. How many people do we have in the hospital? How many do we have in the ICU? And at the worst time we had in the early January, we were about 220 patients per day that were in those beds. In mid-June, we were at 4. We've gotten all the way down to 4 people. This morning, we were at 180. And we have zoomed back up just like everybody else. And it is a real tragedy every day. Next slide. So I said it's because of the Delta variant. What did I mean by the Delta variant? So every time a virus reproduces, every time it replicates, its genes, it tries to make a carbon copy of its genes, but it changes a little bit every time. And so it really is just like us. I like to look at my son and say, oh, he looks like me, but not really. He looks somewhat like me, but he's his own person. And every time one of these viruses replicates, it makes something pretty similar to the first virus, but sometimes it's its own virus. It moves just enough to be a new variant, and it can have some new characteristics. So we started off with what they're now calling the wild type COVID virus. That was the first one that emerged out of China and spread around Europe and then into the United States. That was replaced by one called the Alpha variant, the first variant. Right now, we're dealing with the Delta variant. And what is different about the Delta variant is that it reproduces faster. It goes from 1 virus to 2 viruses to 4 viruses much, much faster than those other variants. So because it's reproducing faster, it's even more infectious. And because it's doing that, it has a higher R0, higher infectiousness rate. With the wild type and the Alpha variant, we were really worried because one person, like myself, could infect 2 people. With the Delta variant, it may be as many as 4 to 6 people. So it is a super infectious strain of COVID, and that's why it's moving so fast. And people ask me, are we going to see other variants? Well, we are. Every virus creates variants. That doesn't mean that we're never going to get out of this. It means that we have to be alert and cautious and tracking, and fortunately, our vaccines are covering these variants well enough to keep us out of the hospital. Maybe not well enough to keep us from having a cold, but well enough to keep us out of the hospital. Next slide. I wanted to put this in because we are now in the age of the Delta variant. Those yellow bars are the Delta variant. That blue bar, that is the Alpha variant. That's the one that was circulating. After we had already had the first wave of wild type, the Alpha variant came in and spread across the nation, and those were the blue ones. Now we've seen that Delta variant go up. And so when you hear people nowadays in the Triad area getting diagnosed with COVID, getting admitted to the hospital, there's a very, very good chance that it was the Delta variant, because that's what's spreading throughout the country right now. Next slide. So a question I get asked a lot is, can we get infected twice? I had COVID before, can I get it again? Well, there's a lot of good data, a lot of good studies that have come out about that. One that I like to point to is this great study in Denmark, in Europe, where they had a wave of virus come through, millions of people got infected, but not the whole country. And then the curve went down, and a few months later, they had another wave come through. And so they looked how many people the second wave had been infected in the first wave, and how many got it the first time. And what they found was that if you got infected, you had pretty good protection. About 80% overall protection, which is great. Now, it is important to know that that number dropped off if you were immunocompromised, if you had cancer, if you were taking immunosuppressant drugs, like chemotherapy drugs or steroids, or just if you were older. And by older, what do I mean by that? Well, really, over the age of 50 is where we see that curve start to bend. So you don't have to be a lot older. And the older we get, the more impact that is. Now, that's just one study. There are lots of studies out there that have shown pretty similar numbers. Natural immunity. People like to talk about, I've already been infected, I have natural immunity. It is great. In fact, it's very robust. You get lots of antibodies and lots of cell-mediated immunity, things in our immune system other than the antibodies, working on all parts of the virus. But we think that it is peaking out at about 80%, and it is dropping off with the Delta variant. And while it lasts really well for about 3 months, pretty well for 6 months, probably okay out to about a year for most people, but that curve goes down. So your risk goes up the further out from the infection you are, and it never has been as good as the vaccines. So let's talk about the vaccines for a minute, and then I'll come back to that natural immunity versus vaccine question. Next slide. So what about the COVID vaccines? There are a number of different ways to make a vaccine. And I just want to remind everybody what a vaccine is. It's a way to trick our immunity, to trick our body into thinking we've been infected without really infecting us, so that our immune cells respond to that germ and build up protection. And so you can do that a lot of different ways. You can take a virus or a bacteria, and you can try to find a weak version, one of the variants of that bacteria or that virus that is not as strong as the normal type, and you can infect people with that. That's what we do with smallpox. That's what we do with measles and mumps. So that's a pretty common historic way to do that. You can also take a germ and kill it, and then give the killed germ, so it's not reproducing to make you sick, but we see it. And that's what we do with a number of different vaccines, like the polio vaccine. You can also take just a piece of the protein, just a piece of the germ, manufacture that germ in the laboratory, and use that. And that's what we do with the pneumonia shot. There are a couple of new ways that we are going about vaccinating for COVID. One is a viral vectored vaccine. That's the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, where they take a virus. In this case, it's a common, they call it an adenovirus. There are dozens of adenoviruses, and they cause either they cause colds or a little GI problem. So they picked one, that number 26, and they made it so that it can't replicate. It's a very mild virus, and then they turned off its ability to replicate, and they gave it some material to deliver to us to show us the germs of COVID-19. So they took a dummy virus to give to us that wouldn't hurt us to show us COVID-19. The other way is the mRNA vaccine, where they just take the sequence of RNA and they give us that goes into our cell, just briefly, and it tells our cells to make that spike protein, that stick that comes off the crown, so that we are able to respond, that our immune system is able to respond to that spike protein. And those have worked really, really well. Next slide. So those are the 3 vaccines that are available in the US. The Pfizer vaccine and the Mrna vaccine are the 2 mRNA vaccines. And then the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is that viral vectored vaccine. And the Pfizer vaccine is now fully approved by the FDA for people over the age 16 and over. The other 2 are still working on what's called an emergency use authorization. And that just means that the FDA has enough information to say it looks safe to give this, but we're still processing all the paperwork. And it takes them a while to process the paperwork. For the Pfizer vaccine, the information that Pfizer gave to the FDA to review all the safety and efficacy data was 360,000 pages long. The book that they gave them to review was 360,000 pages of safety and efficacy data. So it took them 4 months just to read through and process all that data, and that's what they're doing with these other vaccines as well. Next slide. One of the questions I get is, boy, these are brand new vaccines. These mRNA vaccines are so new. I'm worried about it because it's brand new. Well, they are new technology. They've been working on this since the 60s. Really, since the 1980s, they've been working very hard on mRNA vaccines. And before COVID ever hit, they had mRNA vaccines for influenza, for HIV, and for Ebola that were in early clinical trials. And Mrna actually got FDA approval for an mRNA vaccine for a cancer to help people fight a certain type of cancer. They got that FDA approval right at the beginning of the COVID epidemic, and nobody's talked about it because COVID distracted us. Next slide. So how well do these vaccines work? I'm going to show you some scary slides because it's got a lot of graphs on it. And I'm not going to concentrate too much on them, but I'm going to point at that slide. So next slide. So the Pfizer vaccine in the big clinical trial, they looked, that bottom red line is the people who got the vaccine, and the blue line are the people who got the placebo and as they got infection. And to sum it up, it protected 95% of the people who got the vaccine did not get COVID. Next slide. The Mrna vaccine, same thing, that bottom line are the people who got the vaccine, and the curve going up are the people who got the placebo. Again, about 95% were protected. Next slide. We've been doing a study here in North Carolina. We had 30,000 volunteers in North Carolina giving daily information about how they're doing, how they're feeling. We calculated up how did they do. So our local North Carolina data, we found over 90% efficacy in real world data. So not just in that clinical trial. So even among people who would not have qualified for the clinical trial because they had immunocompromising conditions and others, we still found better than 90% efficacy. Next slide. And when a number of people have looked at lots of published studies and they have found the same thing in real world effectiveness studies, over 90% for those mRNA vaccines. Next slide. For the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it's not quite as good because they only gave 1 dose. They just released information this week. If they give a second dose, they get up probably just as high as those others. But with 1 dose, they still had about 70% protection against mild disease and really great protection against hospitalization or death, close to 100%. Next slide. And we know that they work because when we look right now about what's happening in the hospital, unvaccinated people are 15 times more likely to die from COVID than vaccinated people in North Carolina. And around the country, unvaccinated people are 29 times more likely to be hospitalized with COVID than vaccinated people. Next slide. But people say, I've heard people got vaccinated and got sick anyway. What about breakthrough cases? So there are breakthrough cases. My mother was a breakthrough case. You can get vaccinated and still get COVID. But what we're seeing is about 1, maybe 2% of people who are vaccinated having breakthrough cases. And usually when they get them, it's just a cold, a COVID cold. Now, we do see some severe breakthrough cases, tragedies. Usually those are in older people and immunocompromised people. And that's why the CDC has started saying we need to put masks back on, because there's just so much Delta variant going on. We want to protect older immunocompromised people and everybody else. And how many of those deaths have we seen nationally? Really only about 2,000 people who have been vaccinated have died, as compared to over 600,000 unvaccinated people who have died. Next slide. So how are we doing in North Carolina? Well, not real well. We still are only about 60%. We've done great in people over the age of 75 and 85. Lots of our older people have gotten out and gotten vaccinated. We have not done as well in younger people, and that is burning us up. That is what's driving the current epidemic. There are enough people who have not been vaccinated who are getting infected and spreading it to other people. So we really do need to spread the word and get that information out. Next slide, I will say, you have been better than all my medical student classes. You have looked engaged and showing attention. Nobody fell asleep. Nobody checked their phone. I am so appreciative of that. But I realize that I went through a whole lot of information really fast, and I will stay as long as you want. I would love to answer some questions for you if you have any.
Dr. Sanders, I deal with some knuckleheads every day. People that are older, they need the shots. And you answer most everything. I can go back and with an arsenal to deal with them. But two questions that came to mind. Did the COVID-19 come from China?
Did the COVID-19 come from China? Yes. I think that there is almost zero doubt that COVID-19 emerged from China. Now, do we know whether or not it hopped? I'm sorry, are you still hearing me? Okay. Do we know whether it hopped directly from a bat into people in the food market there, where they sell other animals, sell meat? That was the theory originally. Or did it come from a laboratory? We don't honestly know. I will say my opinion is that it probably came from the laboratory. Not that they were intentionally trying to infect us, but they were studying coronaviruses, because we've had SARS and MERS-CoV-2, both emerged in the last couple of years. We were all very worried that we would have a big pandemic like this. And so scientists all around the world were collecting animals and looking at viruses. I think they had a lab accident. My opinion is, I think they had a lab accident and released it.
And my last question is there a possible natural cure?
Is there a possible natural cure? I guess it depends on what you consider natural. So a lot of the medicines that we're using right now are being manufactured, but they came from natural products. We just can't make them, we can't go out and squeeze the plants enough to get enough of the purified material. So they have identified the material from natural products, and then we're making those. For instance, the steroids that we use, our adrenal glands, every animal's adrenal glands make those steroids to help control inflammation in our body. So we're just making potent doses of those natural steroids. So these are all, in essence, things that God showed us how to make to start with. We're just making them in a lot more potency.
Thanks, sir.
Hello, doctor.
Morning, sir.
One question I had about the vaccine. So many people who have already been vaccinated have 6 months or 7 or 8 months of being fully vaccinated. With the shot being waning, how soon will we be able to get boosters?
Oh, that's a great question. So how quickly do we need to get boosters? Do we need to get boosters? So when they put out the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, they wanted to get them out fast, and looking at the data that they had from their initial trials, they thought 2 shots would probably be enough. And it has been enough for most people, but they weren't sure how long that would last. And there are lots of shots, like the hepatitis B shot and the tetanus shot and the pertussis shot, that we have to get multiple doses. And so it's looking like we probably need to get multiple doses to get that immunity. And so right now, the FDA and the CDC are discussing it. They're saying that people who have immunocompromising conditions should probably go ahead and be getting that 3rd shot now. And then almost everybody is probably going to be recommended to get a 3rd shot following about 8 months after your 2nd shot. And that may change. They may move that to 6 months because it's just easier to remember 6 months than it is 8 months. And that would fit some of the other vaccine regimens. And then are we going to have to get, people ask, are we going to have to get a booster every year? We don't know. It will have to wait and see how long the immunity lasts. My guess is that if you're older and immunocompromised, it's probably going to be an every year shot. If you're young, maybe it'll be an every 5-year booster. I think it will fit something like that. And when will those boosters be available? Mid-September to mid-October is what they're saying. Yes, ma'am.
I work with mentally challenged adults, and they come from different homes, and so I don't know what their environments are, but you have to take your mask off to eat your meals, eat your snacks, whatever. Can you get it that fast? Should you keep your mask on all the times? And when do we get the flu shot?
Oh. So the flu shot is out. So you can start getting the flu shot now, and I do recommend it. In terms of masking and how quickly we can spread, so the CDC had to define some numbers, but we ought to keep in mind that it's just a definition. So you can be unlucky and get it just passing by somebody very close to you, or you could spend all day in a room with somebody with COVID and not get infected. But generally, the numbers that they use are 15 minutes within about 6 feet, not masked, is an exposure. And that would be what we use as our general definition. And obviously, we have to take our masks off to eat and drink. We can't keep them on. Some people say, well, how well do the masks work? They work. Are they 100%? No. But it's just common sense that putting a filter between me and you is going to keep me from spitting on you as much. And so it is, they definitely work. I just can't tell you exactly how well they work. Yes, ma'am.
This is not a question, but can you speak on Some people are apprehensive about getting the vaccine because of some of those rare side effects that have happened as a result or after the vaccine, such as heart issues and things like that. Can you speak about some of those things? Because those are some of the things that cause people not to want to get vaccinated.
That is a great question. You said it wasn't a question, but it was still a great question. So people are concerned about the safety, the side effects of these vaccines. Let me start off by saying all three, but especially the mRNA vaccines, are what we would call reactogenic vaccines. Your arm is likely to hurt. You are likely to have some fatigue, some headache, maybe some low-grade fever, and it's likely to last for 12 to 36 hours. So don't be surprised when you get the vaccine that the next day you feel a little punked out. That is okay. Now, the bigger concern is, is there going to be so much inflammation that we see other problems? And we have seen, especially in the Mrna shot, Mrna and Pfizer, but especially in the Mrna shot, young teenage boys having some inflammation in their heart. Now, some of those have been severe enough that they've had to be hospitalized. There have been very, very few that have progressed on to permanent damage. That is happening less often than we see that happen with just the natural infection. So it happens with the natural infection also. It happens with the vaccine much less often than it happens with the natural infection. But I would be not telling you the honest truth if I said, oh, it never happens with the vaccine. It happens with the vaccine. It's just relatively rare. Now, will we find over time that somebody my age might get the vaccine, and because I'm in a heart attack age, that I might get enough inflammation that I could have a heart attack? Well, we haven't seen clear evidence of that yet, but it makes biologic sense that if you're seeing teenage boys get a little inflammation in their heart, that maybe middle-aged men could get inflammation in their heart and have a heart attack. Again, we haven't seen that happen, but I feel very, very confident in saying if the vaccine can do that, the virus can do that and do it a lot more effectively than the vaccine. Now, in terms of long-term safety, a lot of people say, okay, all right, we've now given these vaccines to hundreds of millions of people around the world, and we've watched them for a year, and we've not seen many problems at all. Very, can count on your hands how many problems we've seen. So very, very safe, rare vaccines in the short term. And people say, well, we don't know about the long term. That is true, but I would say we don't see long-term complications with any other vaccine. I don't know of a single long-term complication with the tetanus vaccine or the pneumonia vaccine or the measles vaccine that doesn't show up within the first couple of weeks to couple of months following vaccination. So I don't think that there's any reason for us to really believe that we're going to find something long-term with these vaccines.
Thank you for your knowledge. It's been really good to hear everything that you've had to say. Could you speak on dispelling the rumors that there's a chip in the vaccine, and also proper use of wearing a mask over your nose and on your mouth?
Okay, so let's start with the chip because that is a fun rumor, isn't it? I assume, I've never known for sure, but I assume that the reason that whole chip issue became a rumor is because the mRNA is delivered in something called a nanoparticle. And so I think people said, oh, nanoparticle, there must be, nanoparticles sound like computers, it must be a chip. But what the nanoparticle means is it's a really small piece of fat that coats the mRNA. And the reason that they put these into nanoparticles is because mRNA is very fragile. When our DNA makes messenger RNA, so our cells, our DNA will code for messenger RNA to tell our cells to make proteins, to make things like insulin or steroids in our bodies. So when it codes that messenger RNA, it's just a one-time message. And it doesn't want the mRNA to stay around, so it goes away really quickly. So if we give mRNA in a shot without putting it in a little ball of fat, our body will just wipe it out right away. So it's protected in that little ball of fat until it can get into our cell to give the message to make that spike protein. And that's what a nanoparticle is. There's no computer chip, there's nothing synthetic in there. And I don't know about you, I don't think my life is interesting enough for Bill Gates or the government to be tracking me around. Now, in terms of double masking, masking over our nose, well, clearly, if you're wearing a mask, you want it to be over your nose too, because the virus is in your throat and your nose, and so breathing in and out for protecting yourself and for protecting others, you want to be covering both your mouth and your nose. Now, are 2 masks better than 1 mask? Well, probably using the same common sense we used before. The more filters we put between us, the better, until you suffocate. So at some point, we just have to say, well, we've got as many masks as we can wear, and I'm pretty happy if we just have 1 on.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
You spoke on the youth. I'm in a role where I actually make policy, and I vote on regulations and rules in my school system. My school system in Lexington, my board, we were one of the first ones that mandated masks whenever the children were to start back school here in July. My question, have a little concern about athletes in the athletic department. With the kids getting vaccinated, the football teams, those who play sports, because I myself, as a grandmother, and a leader of a lot of the youth in my community, have a concern about the youth getting the vaccine. That was just me personally. So I just wanted to get what your advice would be as far as that.
Well, first off, I'm going to be praying for you, because I cannot imagine a harder job right now than to be on these decision-making boards about what to do for schools and dealing with concerned parents and concerned teachers and children. So thank you for being in that role. Now, what we should do for kids, clearly right now, the easiest, best tool that we have for people are masks. That doesn't really hurt us to put on a mask to be polite to others. And so I think that from a school board standpoint, it only makes sense that we should be asking students to protect each other and to protect their teachers and back and forth by being masked. Now, I understand concerns. I just mentioned that the mRNA vaccine did show a little inflammation in hearts in some young teenage boys. And so if I was, my youngest kid is a teacher, not a kid anymore. So I haven't had to deal with that stress of whether or not to vaccinate young kids. But I can understand why a parent would feel that because of that inflammation. But again, it is less risky for them to get the vaccine than it is to get infected in terms of that inflammation. So I would still be encouraging athletes to get the shot, to get vaccinated. And, for those of you who are NC State baseball fans, they were this close to winning the national championship, and the outbreak of COVID on their team got them sent home. And boy, I hate to hear that for any athletes anywhere, and that would be true for our high school and junior high athletes as well.
I did want to also allude, I know one of the other counties, their board just, they voted on mandating athletes to be vaccinated. And Would you say that's sort of iffy, or is that getting into legal ramifications when a board goes?
Well, I
different?
think that now, I think there would be some legal challenges, I'm sure. Now that the FDA has fully approved the Pfizer shot, I think most of those legal challenges are going to go away. They're not going to be successful. So I think if a school board said, you have to be vaccinated for this, that would be very similar to them saying you have to be vaccinated for the measles, which is something we have done forever, to say you have to be vaccinated for the measles to come to our school or to participate on our teams. And given how infectious it is to others, then I think that they will win those legal challenges, and it's not unreasonable for a school board to say, this is an FDA-approved vaccine, just like the measles vaccine. We expect you to get it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Doctor, I have two questions. One kind of piggybacks off her question. I've got 3 children that are under 12 years old, so is there anything down the road as far as vaccination for younger children? And also, I had the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and from what I think I read, they recommend that if you get your booster shot, it's from the same type that you had the previous time. Is that your recommendation as well?
Those are two great questions. So the first question is what to do about children under 12. There are clinical research studies, clinical trials underway right now, trying to figure out what the exact safest dose is based on size and age and how effective it is in those kids. We expect those studies to be coming out very soon. They started enrolling in the spring. So we expect more information and then approval on those vaccines for younger kids very soon. It will probably be at a lower dose to take care of some of those inflammation concerns. And when that comes out, I think we ought to look at those data really closely and say, was it safe? I expect it will be. And was it effective? I expect it will be. And then I think it's probably smart to give it. In terms of a booster, right now in the United States, we're saying if you got Johnson & Johnson, you would want a Johnson & Johnson booster. If you got Moderna, Moderna, Pfizer, Pfizer. In England, they've been mixing and matching for a while. Everybody's been safe and doing well. I expect that early on in the US here, we're going to be telling people get the 3rd shot or the 2nd shot for Johnson & Johnson, same as the first ones. But I bet in another year or two, we're going to say, oh, it doesn't matter. Coke and Pepsi mix fine. And you get, because they're all showing our immune system that spike protein. They're all showing the immune system the same thing. They're just showing it to them in slightly different ways.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My question would be, we know we need to get the flu vaccine. We know we need to get the booster. How much time should we allow between these vaccinations for them to be most effective?
Oh, fantastic question. How much time should you allow between the flu vaccine and the COVID vaccine? So last year, we had people getting the COVID people who were late in getting their flu shot and early in getting their COVID shot, got them pretty close together, and they did fine. And so while the CDC has not put out big announcements yet, everybody looking back on last year's experience says it should not cause you any problem at all to get them on the same day or to get them pretty close to each other. Now, it usually takes about 2 weeks for your immune system to fully engage after a shot. So if you said, I really same day, I'd probably separate them by 2 weeks. But really, if you did them closer, it would be fine.
Good morning. I heard you use the term COVID cold. What is the difference in a COVID cold and a regular head cold?
The way you would tell them apart is you can't. It would be a head cold. So you would, if when we get a cold every year, we don't know what virus caused that. All right, we just know that our nose is all stuffed up and maybe our throat is a little sore. It could be a rhinovirus, it could be an enterovirus, it could be an adenovirus, it could be one of those other coronaviruses, or a dozen other different types of viruses. But they all cause us to have congestion, runny nose, scratchy throat. Now, we can say for those of us who are vaccinated, if we get infected with SARS-CoV-2, COVID, that there's a good chance that we'll have a cold, and we won't know whether or not that's from COVID or from rhinovirus, adenovirus, one of those others. So what do we do to tell? Right now, CDC is saying, if you get a cold, it's probably a good idea to get a COVID test because you don't want to infect your elderly friend, or you don't want to take that person who just got their chemotherapy. You don't want to be the person who takes them dinner because you don't want to get them sick with COVID. But you're not going to be able to tell whether this is just a normal cold or this is COVID unless you get a test.
So if you go to the doctor and he diagnosed you with a head cold, are you supposed to quarantine just like with the COVID?
That is a good question too. So yes, I have personal philosophic problems because the medical answer is if you've got a cold, you stay away from people. Don't give them your cold because what is a cold for you, that rhinovirus that's just causing you to have a cold, it could cause me to have pneumonia. So even though it's just a cold for you, you don't want to give it to me. However, this is why I say I have a philosophic problem. I really want people to work, so I hate for them to lay out of work just because they have a sniffle. So that's a really hard question.
If this lady come here, please, and after we will end the Q&A.
I have a question about the COVID testing. So is there a certain period, 'cause I work with a lot of college students, and so I have employees, they'll go get tested, but then 2 days later, they'll take another test and they have a different result. So is there a period where you can get like a fake positive or a fake negative, and should they wait a certain amount of time to take the test after they start getting symptoms of it?
Very good question. So can you get a false positive or a false negative? Yes, at any time you could get a false positive or a false negative. Every test for everything is going to have a certain number of negatives when it's really there or positives when it's not really there. Now, the timing, if somebody has symptoms, they should have a positive test. If somebody says, I was exposed and I want to be tested to see if I got it, if they've been vaccinated, we usually say between 3 and 5 days. If they've not been vaccinated, boy, that incubation period could be 2 to 14 days. And so it's tough to just do one test. If somebody's not been vaccinated, it would really be tough to say that one test is enough to say you didn't get infected. But if you're vaccinated and you get a big exposure, doing a test between 3 and 5 days is pretty good to check.
And how accurate are the at-home tests that they offer now, like in CVS and Walgreens?
So the at-home tests that you can just buy at the store and take home and do yourself, or that they'll deliver to you, are called rapid antigen tests. And so they are looking for the virus and binding to the virus. You swab your nose and you put it in the material, and it detects whether the virus is there. What they often do at the doctor's office is what's called a PCR test, a polymerase chain reaction, where you do the same swab, but when they put it in the material, they try to multiply the virus. So it increases the sensitivity, it increases the ability to detect it. So that at-home test is very good, but most of them are probably 60 to 80% sensitive, as opposed to the PCR tests that are going to be more like 90 to 97% sensitive.
Again, let's thank Dr. Sanders for giving us such great information. Wonderful, great information. And again, thank you for sharing with us so that we can have understanding. I would ask each one of you to become an advocate and inform your family, your friends, your neighbors, or wherever you are, the importance of each one getting the vaccination. Wear your masks as required by the state as well as our city so that we can get our numbers down so we can come back together and enjoy one another's presence. As of today, this will be our last coming together service until we get the numbers down. Next Sunday, we will go back to our virtual services. How long? I don't know. It all depends on the state of our nation as well as our city as we get the numbers down. I don't want to jeopardize no one's life just to have a service as bad as I would like to have a service. Because I think there's strength in us coming together. But until we are able to get the numbers down, let's work with our local officials, do everything we can, be an advocate for the vaccination. I know my wife and I and my family, we all got the vaccination. So therefore, you don't have to fear it, but it's for your safety as well as the safety of your family and others that we all work with our officials. Get the vaccination, wear your mask, so we can get the numbers down, we come back together. So again, I want to thank you, Dr. Sanders, for a blessing. Amen. All right, you may stand. As I told you earlier, as you go out, you could drop your offering pails in the offering envelopes, or your offering in the offering pails. The ushers will be. We're going to dismiss our seniors first. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be upon each and every one of you. Rest, rule, and abide with us forever, God. We trust in you, Jesus. We look to you for everything, to lead us, to guide us, provide for us, to be our protection. And we thank you and we praise you. Again, thank you, St. Peter's, for coming. Again, we're going to ask our seniors if they'll dismiss themselves first. Allow the seniors to go out first.